What would you do if the very men who stole everything your father built threw you off a cliff and rode away certain the canyon would finish what they started? And what would you do if, at the bottom of that canyon, broken and bleeding in a place no one ever climbs back out of, you found the one thing those men had spent 18 years praying no living soul would ever open? For 18 years, a black road stage hung on a narrow ledge halfway down the wall of Dead Mule Gorge, south of Sweetwater, Utah Territory. It was a Concord coach, the kind that once carried mail and strong boxes across the high desert, chained to the rock by its own seized brake. Half the town could see it from the rim on a clear morning, and none of them ever walked out to look. They called it the hangman's coach, told their children it was haunted, and were grateful for a reason never to go down and look inside. Mara Quinn was 22 years old the day she went down to it. She did not climb down. She was thrown. This is the story of how the lowest place in the whole territory became the only place that ever told her the truth. Before we go down into that gorge with her, if stories of forgotten frontier women who refused to stay buried are the kind of thing you settle in with of an evening, take a moment to subscribe and tell us in the comments where you are listening from tonight. Now, let us go back to the morning everything was taken. Mara's father was a freighter named Elias Quinn, and for most of her life, the Quinn name meant something good along the Sweetwater Road. Elias ran supply wagons between the railhead at Cedar Crossing and the mining camps in the Tushar foothills, and he ran them honest, which in that country was rarer than gold. He kept a small house at the edge of town, 4 good mules, and a daughter he had raised alone since the fever took her mother when Mara was 6. She could still see him at the kitchen table, a lamp between them, drawing her finger down a column with his. "A column of numbers is a kind of conscience, Mara," he would say. "You can argue with a man, you can argue with a preacher, you cannot argue with a sum. It either adds or it doesn't, and it doesn't care whose feelings it hurts. What if a man lies in his book? Then his book lies for him until somebody honest reads it. That's why you keep yours so plain a stranger could pick it up and know in 5 minutes exactly what you owe and what you're owed. An honest book is a witness that never dies and never gets scared." She had thought it was only bookkeeping. She did not know that whole growing-up time that her father kept a second book. Elias Quinn died in the spring of 1871, thrown from the seat when a wheel split on the grade above the gorge. That, at least, was the story. Mara was at the house when his foreman, a broad, quiet man named Cole Dyer, brought the body in and stood in her doorway turning his hat against his chest. "It was the off-front wheel," he said. "Old Kraken the fellow must have been. He'd have known nothing, Mara. One moment driving, the next gone. That's a mercy in a way. My father checked every wheel on every wagon the night before a haul," Mara said. "I watched him do it 1,000 times. He'd have known nothing, because there was nothing to know." "Grief makes us want a reason," Dyer said, gentle as a priest. "Sometimes there isn't one. Your daddy was like a brother to me. I'll see you looked after. You have my word on it." She believed him then. That was the part she could never forgive herself for after. That for a whole month she had believed him. The way Cole Dyer looked after her was this. Within a month he had produced papers and brought 2 other men in good coats to her father's front room to read them to her, the way you read a hard thing to a child. The freight line, The wagons, the mules, the house she had grown up in, all of it, the paper said, had been signed over in the weeks before Elias died to settle debts Mara had never heard of. There was a banker's seal and a lawyer's signature. "Your father was a proud man," the lawyer said, smoothing a page flat. "Proud men borrow quietly. We carried him a long while, Miss Quinn, longer than business allows." "My father never borrowed $1 he didn't write down," Mara said. "Show me where he wrote these down." "It's all here," the banker said, and tapped the seal. "Witnessed and sealed." "By you," she said. "Witnessed by the men it pays." Cole Dyer crouched in front of her chair then, hat in his hands, gentle as a father. "Mara, there's no money to fight this with, and no man in the territory to fight it for you. The kindest thing now is to take what you can carry and go. Don't make it ugly. He wouldn't have wanted it ugly." She was 19 years old. She took a worn dress, her father's freighting maps, and one thing more, a small tan leather satchel he had carried on every haul, worn soft at the corners that still smelled of axle grease and pipe smoke, and him. She walked out of the only home she had ever known with that satchel on her shoulder, and did not cry where they could see her. For 3 years after that, Mara lived the way the dispossessed live in a town that has decided you are nobody. She washed linens, mended harness, slept in a lean-to behind the church, and ate what the hotel cook set out back for the dogs. And all that time, she watched Cole Dyer ride the Sweetwater Road in her father's coat on her father's lead mule, growing fat and rich on a freight line built by a man whose grave Mara tended alone. She never once believed the papers. A girl taught to read a ledger before she was 10 knew the difference between a sum that added up and a sum that had been made to. But believing a thing and proving it are two different countries, and Mara had no road between them. She tried, in the early days. She went to the territorial marshal in Sweetwater, a tired man named Pruitt, and laid it out for him at his own desk. "The freight totals don't match the books they filed," she said. "His best season, and the papers show him broke. A line doesn't go broke hauling more than it ever hauled. Somebody emptied it from the inside, Marshal." Pruitt rubbed his face. "You read all that in a column of figures." "My father taught me to." "Miss Quinn." He pushed the papers back across the desk, not unkindly. "There's a banker's seal on this and a lawyer's name. Papers are papers. A girl with nothing does not go up against 3 men with everything, and I am too old and too poor to help her try. Go home, if you have a home." He had not met her eye when he said it, and that was how she knew the rot ran past Cole Dyer into the marshal's office, too. She had it out with Cole Dyer just once, in the street outside the freight office, the only argument the two of them ever had. She had memorized the freight totals for the last season her father was alive, the numbers she had helped him tally herself at the kitchen table, and she stood in his path and threw them at him. "Your books say the line hauled 400 tons that year," she said. "I tallied it with him. It hauled near 1,100, his best season in 20 years, and your papers show him broke." She did not blink. A freight line doesn't go broke hauling 3 times what it ever hauled. Somebody emptied it from the inside, Cole. I helped add the column. I know what was in it. For just a moment, the easy face slipped, and she saw she had hit something true. Then it closed again. "Grief does strange things to a young woman's memory," he said, gentle as ever, and stepped his mule around her, and that was the last she spoke to him for 3 years. But she kept those numbers the way some people keep a prayer. The thing that changed everything was a letter, and the letter came in the spring of 1874, 3 years to the month after her father died. It came from a man named Henry Tull, and Henry Tull was dying. He had been the youngest of her father's drivers, a shy man with a stammer who drifted off to the mining camps after Elias died. Now he was coughing his lungs out in a bunkhouse up in the Tushars, and his conscience would not let him go quiet. The letter was short, the hand bad. It said, "Miss Quinn, your father did not die of a bad wheel. He died because he found out where the Dell Gang's money went, and he wrote it down, and the wrong men learned he had. He kept his proof in the place no one would ever look. Ask yourself why the hangman's coach has hung in that gorge 18 years and not one soul has gone down to it. Ask yourself who put it there. I am sorry I was afraid. The book is in the box, and the box is in the coach. Forgive me." Mara read that letter 4 times, standing in the road with the boarding-house wash going cold in her arms, and she knew the rest of that story the way every child in Sweetwater did. 18 years before, when the Dell Gang ran the high desert roads, a Wells and Holt coach carrying a mine payroll had gone off the Sweetwater grade and lodged on the ledge halfway down the wall. The driver and the guard were both killed, and the gold was never found. The town said the Dell Gang had taken it. The gang swore they never had. The coach simply stayed where it fell, too far down to recover and too dangerous to reach, until it became a thing you pointed at from the rim and did not think about. Haunted, best left alone. Mara stood in the road and understood it all at once, the way you understand the shape of a room when lightning shows it to you. Her father had found out what became of that payroll, written it down, and hidden the book where no living person would go. And the men who threw him from the grade above the gorge had not chosen that grade by accident. They had killed him within sight of the very coach that held the proof and let him hang in the public memory as a careless old man, because the gorge kept their secret better than any grave. She did not go back to the marshal. Instead, she went out to the little fenced plot behind the church where she had buried her father 3 years before, and crouched there a long time with the letter in her hand before she spoke. "You knew," she said to the stone. "You knew what they were, and you wrote it down anyway, and you hid it in the worst place in the county so it would outlive them. You always did say a true book is a witness that never dies." She wiped her eyes once, hard, and stopped. "All right, I'll go get your witness. I don't know how a girl with nothing climbs into that coach, but I'll find out the way you found everything out. I'll follow the numbers." Then she folded the letter into the satchel beside his maps and began, quietly, to plan how a girl with nothing was going to get down the wall of Dead Mule Gorge into a coach that 18 years of stronger, richer people had been too afraid to touch. She did not get the chance to plan it in peace. A dying man's letter is a hard thing to keep quiet. In the last fog of his fever, Tull had talked too, and a teamster carried the talk down out of the Tushars. And within a week the word reached Cole Dyer that Elias Quinn's daughter was about to dig something out of the gorge that would put a rope around better men's necks. Cole Dyer did not panic. He simply decided that the girl had been a loose thread for 3 years, and that loose threads in his experience were best not pulled but cut. He came for her himself, with 2 riders, on a bright cold morning at the head of the gorge trail. He had grown heavy since he took her father's coat, and it strained at his shoulders now, but his voice was the same easy, fatherly voice he had used in her front room. "Mara Quinn," he said, reining up across the trail so she could not pass. "Where is a girl off to so early, all the way out here?" She had her father's satchel slung across her back and a coil of hemp rope over one shoulder, because she had meant only to go look at the descent that morning, and now there were 3 horses in front of her and the whole empty country behind. "Out walking," she said. "Walking to the gorge," Dyer said, "with a rope." He shook his head slowly, sorrowfully, the way a man shakes his head at a thing he has tried so hard to prevent. "I had hoped old Toll would have the decency to die with his mouth shut. He always was a weak one. Your daddy carried him 3 seasons. He wasn't worth carrying." Mara's hands did not shake. She would think about that after. She would be proud after that her hands had not shaken. "My father carried a lot of men who weren't worth carrying," she said. "I'm starting to learn just how many." The easy patience went out of Cole Dyer's face then, and what was under it was not a monster, which would have been easier. It was a tired, comfortable, frightened man who had built a whole good life on top of one cold morning 18 years ago, and could not bear the ground shifting now. "There's nothing down in that gorge but a dead man's coach and 18 years of buzzards," he said. "But I see you've made up your mind to go look. So," he nodded to the riders, "let's help her down." The riders walked their horses in on either side of her and took her to the lip of the gorge at the steepest place, well above the ledge where the coach hung, where the wall went down sheer for 100 feet. Cole Dyer took the satchel off her shoulder, looked inside, and drew out Henry Tull's letter and her father's maps and the rope. "You don't have to do this, Cole," she said. "You could ride away. I'm a girl with a broken claim and no proof. Nobody listens to me anyway. You said so yourself." That was true yesterday. He folded the letter into his own coat. Tull made it not true. You'd dig and you'd find, and a banker and a lawyer and an old foreman would hang for things done long before you were grown. I've worked too hard and too long for the life I've got, Mara. I am not going to lose it to a girl with a rope." He looked at her a long moment with something that might, in a better man, have been shame. "For what it's worth, your daddy was the best man I ever rode with. That's why it had to be him, and not somebody who deserved it less." "That's not worth anything at all," Mara said, and he gave the satchel back to her, empty, almost gently, as if leaving her the one thing she loved were a kindness. Then he nodded, and the riders put their hands on her, and the canyon came up to meet her. The fall should have killed her, and the men who rode away that morning half believed it had. It did not kill her, because a dead juniper, growing out of the wall 40 feet down, snagged her dress and turned her, and because the scree at the bottom was deep and loose and took the fall in stages instead of all at once. She came to rest with a broken left arm, 3 cracked ribs, a gash above her ear that filled one eye with blood, and an ankle she could not stand on. But she came to rest, breathing, and somewhere above her, in the heat shimmer off the red rock, she could see the black shape of the hangman's coach on its ledge, exactly halfway between where she lay and the sky she had been thrown out of. She had nothing now, no letter, no maps, no rope, a broken arm and a satchel emptied of everything but its smell of her father. She could have lain down and waited for the country to finish what the men had not, and a great many people would have. She lay there a long time. Then she rolled onto her good side, looked up at the coach on its ledge above her, and said the words out loud to the empty gorge in a cracked whisper to make herself believe them. "The book is in the box," she said, "and the box is in the coach, and the coach is right there." She wet her lips. "Figures don't lie for the men who keep them crooked, Papa. You always said so. There's a true page up there waiting to be read, and I am the only soul in this territory who can reach it. So I am not going to die in this wash. I am going to climb." They had thrown her down to keep her from the one place she needed to be, and the gorge had dropped her not into the dry wash, but onto the long tailless slope that ran up under the very ledge where the coach hung. She had not been thrown away from the proof. She had been thrown nearly into its lap. She began to climb. It took her the rest of that day and into the night, dragging a broken arm and a useless ankle up 40 feet of shifting talus. Twice she slid back almost to the bottom and lay still and wept. Once for the pain, once because she thought of her father going off that same grade above her and what he must have known in the half-second of the wheel splitting. She climbed in the dark by feel, looping the empty satchel's strap over a snag of rock to take her weight while she found the next hold. A little before dawn, fingers torn and her broken arm screaming in its dress-cloth sling, she pulled herself over the lip of the ledge, lay against the coach's cold iron-shod wheel, and laughed very quietly in the dark. She had reached the one thing nobody in the territory had dared to reach, because the men who feared it had put her there themselves. Dawn lit the coach hard and gold and merciless of detail. Up close, the hangman's coach was not a ghost story. It was a Concord road coach. The body once green and now blistered gray, the iron run to deep orange rust. Through one cracked window gap, she could see the pale shape of something on the floor that she made herself not look at too long, because she knew already it was a man who had been waiting in there a very long time for somebody to come. The door would not open. The rust had taken the latch and the years had warped the frame, and a girl with one good arm could not force it. So she did what her father had taught her without meaning to. She stopped fighting the door and read the problem instead. The window leather on the lower door was cracked and curling. She worked her good hand into the gap and pulled, and the brittle leather and rotten wood came away in pieces all that morning, until the lower half of the door was a ragged hole she could climb through into the dark belly of the coach. There were 2 men in there. One had been the driver and one the guard, by the brass buttons gone green on what was left of their coats. And they did not frighten her the way the town story had meant them to. They were not the ghost. They were the witnesses. She told them so out loud because there was no one else to tell. "I'm sorry it took so long," she said. "Somebody's come now." And then, wedged under the driver's seat, where a strong box rides, she saw the box. It was a Wells and Holt express box, oak bound in iron, with a lock no road agent's bullet had ever beaten, which was, the whole country had assumed for 18 years, exactly why the Dell gang never got the payroll. And Mara understood the cold joke. Nobody robbed this coach. The gold had gone off the road and into the gorge with the box still locked, and there it stayed. The men who got rich off the Sweetwater Road got rich on a different theft entirely. And her father had hidden his proof inside the legend itself, where the fear of the place guarded it better than any vault. It took her until afternoon to reach the box. She could not lift it, broken as she was, so she worked the lid where it sat. And here the cold joke turned in her favor because her father had been there before her, and the lock was not locked. He had pried it once, slipped his proof in beside what the box held, and left the lid closed but unfastened, so the next person to reach this place need only lift it. She lifted it. Inside, under a canvas mail sack gone stiff as a board, was the mine payroll the whole territory had spent 18 years arguing about. Coin and small gold bars, more money than Mara had ever seen, sitting exactly where it had fallen, never stolen at all, and lying flat on top of it, wrapped in oilcloth against the damp, dry and whole and waiting, was a book. It was a freight ledger, plain brown board covers, a column rule down every page, her father's small, square, honest hand filling line after line. And it was not, she saw as the afternoon light fell across the pages, an account of mules and hauls. It was an account of where the money went, because Elias Quinn, in the last season of his life, had done what an honest bookkeeper does when the sums stop adding up. He had followed them. The Dell Gang's real take from a decade of robbery had never been spent or buried. It had been bought off the road agents at 20 cents on the dollar and washed clean through a freight line that hauled more on paper than, in fact, his own line. The money was not lost. It was being eaten from the inside, and her father had named the men, dated the payments, and matched each to a robbery in his small, square, honest hand. There were 3 names that ran all the way down the ledger, season after season taking their cut. Tobias Hale, the banker, who held the seal that had signed away her house. Septimus Reardon, the lawyer, whose signature was on the papers, and Cole Dyer, her father's foreman, the man who held his hat against his chest and said he would see the girl looked after, and who had thrown her into this gorge the morning before to keep her from this exact page. Mara sat on the ledge with the lost gold in her lap and her father's ledger open across her broken arm, and she read every name aloud, in the gold light, to the only listeners she had, the 2 dead men who had kept this place 18 years. Tobias Hale, she read, banker, $412, autumn of '65, against the Cedar Crossing payroll. Septimus Reardon, lawyer, $300, spring of '66, against the Tusher freight robbery. She turned a page with her torn fingers, and here he is, every season, Cole Dyer. My father wrote his own foreman's name in his own hand and hid it under a dead man's coat, where only someone who loved him enough and was stubborn enough would climb to the bottom of the world to read it. She looked up at the driver and the guard. He knew somebody would come. He just didn't know it would be his girl. She did not weep, because the weeping had been in the talus in the dark, and this was a different thing. The proof was in front of her at last, in his own hand, and she understood that getting it was only half the climb. The harder half was the one that went up. She read the ledger through the long afternoon and slept that night against the wheel, too spent to climb, and rested one more night after that, letting her torn hands harden. In the gold of the following morning, she wrapped the ledger in oilcloth and put it in her father's satchel, emptied, and handed back to her as a cruelty, now the thing that would carry his proof up into the light. She filled it with what gold she could carry, and then Mara Quinn, with one good arm and a fortune and a ledger of names, started up the wall of the gorge that no one had ever climbed. If a story of a woman climbing back up out of the place she was thrown to is the kind of thing that stays with you, we would be grateful if you stayed with her to the top and told us in the comments the name of the person who never stayed buried, no matter how hard the world tried. The climb out took her 2 days, And she did it the way she did everything, by reading the rock instead of fighting it, bracing inside a dry chimney, resting on ledges no wider than the ledger she carried, refusing the gorge every time it invited her to let go. She came over the rim on the morning of the 6th day after Cold Dyer threw her in, and the first living thing she met was the old prospector everyone called Sundown Pratt, a white-bearded man who panned the dry washes for color he never found, and had, the town agreed, been a little touched since the silver played out. Sundown, Pratt found a girl coming up out of the haunted gorge with a broken arm and a dead man's gold spilling from a satchel, and he did not run. He gave her his water and crouched beside her in the red dirt. "Where'd you come up from, girl?" he said. "There's nothing down there but the dead coach." "There was a book down there," Mara said, "in the dead coach, my father's book. It says who got rich off this road, and how, and which stage robbery paid for which respectable man's house." She held the satchel against her broken arm. "And it says they killed him for it." The old man went very still. "Quinn," he said, "you're Elias Quinn's girl." "I am. I drove for your daddy. One season, before the silver, he was the only man on that road ever paid me what he said he would." He looked at the satchel a long time, and his wet eyes cleared. "I always wondered why a careful man like Elias went off that grade. A careful man." He spat in the dust. 18 years I've panned dead washes, waiting for one true thing to come up out of this country. And here it comes up out of the worst hole in it, carried by a girl with one arm." He got his shoulder under hers. "Let's get you to town, Miss Quinn, and let's not go quiet." They did not go quiet. That was the thing the three of them had never planned for, because in 18 years of being respected, they had forgotten that the truth, once it gets up out of the gorge, has a way of running downhill faster than any of them could ride. Sundown Pratt did not take her to Cold Dyer, nor to the lawyer or the banker. He took her on a borrowed mule, the full day's ride to Cedar Crossing, where the railroad was, where the territorial circuit judge happened to be holding the spring session, and where there were two things Sweetwater did not have: a United States deputy marshal who owed Tobias Hale nothing, and a telegraph. What happened over the next 3 days happened fast, and in the open, which is the only way Mara would have it. The deputy marshal at Cedar Crossing was a young man named Estes. He read the ledger by lamplight, Mara across from him and Sundown Pratt by the door, turning the pages slower and slower, and when he was done he sat back and was quiet for a while. "Miss Quinn," he said, "do you understand what this is?" "It's my father's bookkeeping," Mara said. "He was very good at it." Estes almost smiled. "It's 11 years of evidence in 11 robberies, matched to the men who washed the money, with dates, with amounts." He tapped the brown cover. "I have spent 2 years trying to find one honest thread to pull on Tobias Hale, and a dead freighter hid the whole rope in a coach at the bottom of a gorge." "Then arrest them," Mara said. "It is not that simple, and you know it isn't." He stood up. "They will say you forged it. A girl with a grudge and a sack of stolen gold, scribbling a dead man's name in a ledger to ruin the town's best men. They have lawyers and a banker and money. You have a broken arm and a book." "I have my father's hand," Mara said. "Send a writer to Sweetwater, bring back any freight bill Elias Quinn ever wrote, any receipt, anything with his letters on it, and set it beside this. He couldn't lie in a column if you paid him to. The way he crossed a 7, the way he ruled a line, No forger alive could match it, and no forger alive would forge 40 entries that each match a robbery you already half suspect. She put her good hand flat on the cover. Let them call it forgery. Make them say it under oath, with his handwriting on the table next to mine. Estes studied her for a moment. Your father teach you to argue like that? My father taught me to add, she said. Arguing I learned at the bottom of the gorge. And here is the part the town of Sweetwater tells to this day, the part that makes the children go quiet by the fire. The circuit judge, a flint-eyed old man named Vance, who had hanged road agents in the early days and kept no love for the respectable kind of thief, convened his court and sent Estes with a writ to bring Tobias Hale, Septimus Reardon, and Cole Dyer down to answer. And they came, because men in good coats always believe, right up to the last morning, that being respected is the same thing as being safe. They came expecting a hysterical girl. They found a courtroom, a federal officer, a judge who had read the ledger twice, and Mara Quinn in the front row with her arm in a clean splint and her father's satchel in her lap. It was the lawyer, Septimus Reardon, who tried first because talking was his trade. He rose, smooth as ever, and he turned to the judge and spread his hands. Your Honor, this is a tragedy and a fraud both. This poor girl lost her father 3 years ago, and her wits with him, it would seem. She has somehow come into a quantity of gold, stolen, no doubt, from the old wreck, and a book she claims her father wrote. I have known the Quinn family for years. Out of Christian mercy, I would ask the court not to add a forgery charge to whatever else. Mr. Reardon. Judge Vance did not raise his voice. On the 14th page of this book, there is an entry dated October of 1868. $400 paid to S. Reardon against the Painted Rock stage robbery of the same week. Do you deny you received $400 in October of 1868? The lawyer's smooth face did a thing then that Mara would remember the rest of her life. A man receives many fees, Your Honor. A fee is not a crime. I could hardly be expected to recall the date of— You recalled the date of the robbery well enough to take your cut the same week, Vance said. It is in his hand, and it is matched to a robbery, and there are 40 more like it, and you will deny each one under oath. He turned. Mr. Hale, the bank seal on the deed that took this girl's home, did you affix it? Tobias Hale was a banker, and a banker's whole life is knowing when an account has gone irretrievably to the bad. He rose slowly. He had meant, Mara could see, to say something practiced. Then he looked at the open ledger on the judge's table, and the practiced thing died in his throat. My father kept his books so plain a stranger could read them in 5 minutes, Mara said into the silence, not loudly, only so Hale could hear. Go on. Tell the court the sum is wrong. Tell us the column doesn't add. Hale started and stopped. The figures— He stopped again. A banker cannot say a true column lies. It is the one thing his whole life has trained him never to say. I have nothing to say, he managed at last, and sat down, and saying nothing was the most honest thing Tobias Hale had ever done. And then it was Cole Dyer's turn. He had never been a talker. He had been a doer. He sat with his big hands flat on his knees and looked across the courtroom at the girl he had thrown into Dead Mule Gorge 6 days before and been certain all 6 of those days was dead. He looked at her splinted arm and her father's satchel in her lap, and the comfortable color went out of his face and left it gray as the blistered wood of the coach. "You went down," he said. It was not a question. The whole courtroom heard it, and the whole courtroom went still, because in those 3 words Cole Dyer had said more than the lawyer's whole speech. "You put me down," Mara answered, and she stood up to say it, the satchel hanging at her side where it belonged, on the steepest part above the ledge. "You took my father's letter and his maps, and you left me the satchel because you thought leaving it was kind." Her voice did not shake. She had earned that in the talus, in the dark. "You threw me at the one thing in the whole world you were trying to keep me from. He hid it in the coach, Cole. 18 years you rode past that gorge and pointed at the haunted coach and were grateful nobody ever went down. He hid your name inside the very story that kept everyone out." She lifted the satchel an inch. "I climbed down to where you sent me, and then I climbed back up, and I brought the book." For a long moment, Cole Dyer said nothing. Then the thing he had carried 3 years came up out of him, in front of the whole valley, in the flat voice of a man too tired to lie any more. "It was never a bad wheel," he said. "Your daddy came to me the week before, laid it all out on my own table, the way you're laying it out now. Said he'd written it down, and he was taking it to Cedar Crossing." He looked at his hands. "I told Hale. I told Reardon. And we rode up the grade ahead of him, and we loosened the off-front wheel ourselves, and we waited at the top to see it done." His voice did not rise. "I held my hat to my chest at his burying, and I meant the sorrow. That's the part nobody believes. I was the best friend he had, and I killed him for a freight line, and then I threw his girl off the same grade and slept fine doing it." He raised his eyes to Mara. "I slept fine until you walked in that door." That was the public vindication of Elias Quinn. 3 years after a bad wheel that was never a bad wheel. Judge Vance held the 3 men over for federal trial on charges from receiving stolen property to murder, for the driver and guard dead in the gorge 18 years gone, and for the killing of Elias Quinn, which the ledger, a dying man's letter, and Dyer's confession made plain, had never been an accident. The trial came months later, but the end of it was that Tobias Hale and Septimus Reardon went to the territorial prison, and Cole Dyer was hanged in the spring of 1875, in sight of the rim where you can see the coach, which the people of Sweetwater found a terrible and fitting thing. But the trial is not where Mara would want us to leave her, because she never cared as much about what the men lost as about what was given back. The express company had been waiting 18 years for that payroll, and they paid a recovery to the one who brought it up. Enough that Mara could have left Sweetwater and never looked at Red Rock again. She did not leave. The freight line, the wagons, the mules, and the home on the edge of town were restored to her by the court. The false deed struck down. The banker's seal worth nothing now, but shame. Mara walked back into the house she had been told to leave, hung her father's satchel on the peg by the kitchen door where it had always hung, and sat down at the table where he had first put a ledger in front of her, and for a long while did nothing at all but be home. She ran the Quinn freight line herself after that, the way her father had, every haul in a plain hand any honest man could read, and no crooked one could twist. She hired Sundown Pratt, who never panned another dry wash, and was, the drivers agreed, the best storyteller on the Sweetwater Road, especially on the subject of a girl who came up out of the haunted gorge with the truth in a leather bag. She paid for Henry Tull's burial up in the Tushars with a stone that said only that he had been brave at the end. And once, in the first autumn after, she rode out alone to the lookout on the rim and looked down at the black shape on the ledge, where two patient men had waited 18 years. The recovery men had brought the gold up, but the coach was still too far down to move, and Mara found she did not want it moved. She wanted it left exactly where it was, between the bottom of the gorge and the sky, the way it had hung her whole life, because the town had been wrong about it all those years. It was not the hangman's coach. The only hangman in the story had worn a good coat, ridden her father's lead mule, and called himself her protector. The coach was the one honest witness in a county full of liars, and it had held its truth steady in the dark for 18 years, until the only person desperate enough to come for it finally did. Mara sat a long time on the rim that autumn afternoon, the satchel on her shoulder, the wide, warm southwest sky going gold behind the canyon walls. Then she turned her mule for home and rode back to the life that had been hers all along, and that no man's good coat would ever take from her again. They had thrown her into the lowest place in the territory to bury the truth. They had not understood that some things, once they are written down in an honest hand, do not stay buried no matter how deep you throw them. They only wait on a ledge between the dark and the sky for the one person stubborn enough to climb down after them and then to climb back up. That is the story of Mara Quinn and the hangman's coach and the ledger that named every man who wronged her. If any part of it stayed with you, the climb down, the climb up, or the moment a tired man finally spoke the truth out loud and a daughter set her father right in front of the whole valley, we would be honored if you would leave a like and tell us in the comments which part of Mara's story resonated with you the most. And if a quiet evening with the relics the frontier left hanging, and the women who finally climbed down and cut them loose, is how you like to unwind, be sure to subscribe, and we will see you on the next tale of the Forgotten Frontier. Thank you for going down into the gorge with her tonight. It is a finer thing to have company on the climb back up.